Right? I'm still waiting for the politician that stands up and says, listen, we made mistakes, huge mistakes, but we're going to turn the ship around. It's not happening. And it always reminds me of the Toynbee quote, right? When he's, civilizations don't die from murder, they die from suicide.
Welcome to Redacted Conversations. This is a place where we invite journalists, thought leaders, whistleblowers on to tell us their story and to talk about the news that you might not see in the mainstream media. One of the big stories that we've been covering here on the show is, of course, the farmer revolt. Farmers saying enough is enough, taking to the streets, dumping manure at the foot of government offices across the Netherlands and around the world, quite honestly, saying we will not stand for your draconian government regulations and restrictions on nitrogen, etc. Well, we're also seeing the fallout in Germany, where officials saying it could be a dark winter, restricting the amount of heat that people in Germany can use, thanks to, again, draconian pullbacks on regulations. We've got a special guest, journalist Ralph Schoellhammer. He's a journalist who's been covering the energy crisis across Europe, the Dutch farmer revolt. We're going to talk about that, the hypocrisy of world leaders when it comes to green energy policy. Ralph, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm very happy to be on with you.
Well, absolutely. The pleasure is ours. And I've been really enjoying your journalism, your great writing, and your thoughts on this. Sorely needed, by the way, I should say, in a Western media that is largely quiet on this issue. So we're going to talk about the Dutch farmer revolt, the latest on that. But first, news of the day. I want to talk about what's going on in Germany, the current state of affairs. Germany facing a dark winter. Energy costs exploding, nuclear power plants turned off, although there seems to be concessions on that piece. Germans are told they need to turn down their heaters because this is how you support Ukraine at the end of the day. And if you complain about it, then you're a dissenter. you're not worthy. And you just wrote a really great piece about this. And I wanted to get your take on where things stand today. What is Germany planning to do as we head into this dark winter?
To be honest, I think they're not planning much, right? At least when it comes to addressing the structural problems at the bottom. You just mentioned correctly, there was a Wall Street Journal article just about 24 hours ago where they claimed, or what the Wall Street Journal claimed, that there is a turnaround when it comes to the three last remaining nuclear power plants in Germany, that they will continue at least into the year 2023. But now it turned out immediately after that article was dropped, the German climate ministry denied it in its entirety. They say there is no factual basis for the assumption that these nuclear power plants will continue to operate. They say, maybe there's a little bit of a concession. They say they are still kind of stress testing them. But even that is a little bit weird because the German technical union, who kind of does all these they check the kind of equipment, they see whether or not it's still up to date, if it can still run. And they said, well, the nuclear power plants are in excellent technical condition. They're old, and we might have to talk about this as well, right? They were built in the 1960s and 1970s. So this was the last period when Germany could still build nuclear power plants. But despite their age, they are still fully functional. So the decision kind of to turn them off or not to continue them running is a purely political decision. And the background of this political decision, I would argue, is purely ideological. Right? The German government, by the way, also the quote unquote conservative government under Angela Merkel, they dedicated themselves to, move Germany out of the nuclear age. And kind of we now see the results of this, because the dirty secret in the background was, sure, we don't use nuclear, right? Sure, we don't use fracking in Germany, something we can touch on as well. But they just imported everything from Russia, right? Kind of hoping that this card they played under the table will never be a larger problem. And now we see with the war in Ukraine that the problematic nature of this policy is fully revealed.
You write about an attack on nuclear. We've been obviously seeing what's been happening at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant in Ukraine, 6 reactors. The United States largely responsible for allowing HIMARS to be targeting, and that's the latest part of this story, targeting this nuclear power plant, which to my mind, what I've been saying here on the show is a war crime. The West is largely quiet on this issue. Nuclear is actually the least dangerous energy available, and yet Germany aimed to take it down while Russia is beginning to lead in nuclear energy. So there is this shift away from fossil fuels and demonization of nuclear that we keep hearing about. You've even had Elon Musk coming out and trying to get rid of this myth that nuclear that we should be demonizing nuclear power, right?
Yes, no, I think that's correct. And I think you can almost put a timestamp on when it happened. Kind of the green movement in Europe that then also, I would argue, gradually spilled over into the United States. The environmental movement that is particularly hostile to fossil fuels and to nuclear energy that really started to emerge in the late 60s and early 70s. So it's what we would call, you see it a little bit also, if you remember, the hippie movement, right? Kind of that they wanted to live in communes and, kind of in sync with nature, all these ideas that are, in hindsight, it's easy to mock them. But of course, they did have an impact as these people were gradually marching through political and societal institutions, that these ideas became much more powerful, I think, that we believed originally, right? The idea was always that rationality or kind of the obvious will be victorious in the end. And as you just correctly mentioned, in many ways, nuclear energy would have been the obvious solution to many problems. But if there is a huge ideological barrier, a quasi, I would almost say, religious barrier to it, then this is very, very difficult to overcome. And this is exactly, I think, what we see happening in this area.
We've seen a number of protests over the past few weeks in Germany. And today, this is an amazing story, interview with a German news outlet, NT. We have the interior minister of Germany basically saying anybody who's protesting, whether it was lockdowns or mandates, and now he says, having to turn down your thermostat, an energy crisis, that you are an enemy of the state. You are an extremist. Yes. This is crazy.
And this was you said it perfectly, right? This was really kind of a Staatsfeind, to use the German word. So this is really a terminology in that way we have last heard in Eastern Germany, right, in the German Democratic Republic, so in communist Germany, if you want, and of course also in a much darker time in Germany during the fascist time in Germany. So you're absolutely right. This is, again, I'm not saying that these are the same things, but you see, again, the shift in the conversation, exactly what you just said. So they know that their policy of the past is about to run against a brick wall. So what you now see preemptively happening is to denounce everyone who is going to protest against it as an enemy of the state, who most likely is in cahoots with right-wing extremists, which is, again, kind of, I guess we would say in the United States, we would say is basically dog whistles to say, right-wing extremists equals, Nazis. So this is exactly the direction which this is going. So everybody, or the second great insult that is now being spread to Germany, it means you are secretly a supporter of Putin and the war against Ukraine. So they're already kind of preemptively trying to diminish any possible criticism that aim at the consequences of these failed policies in the past. So this is really, the dark times, as I said before, they're probably just about to come. We have not reached the peak of this.
No, not even close. It seems like we're maybe months away from maybe more widespread awareness of this, which I guess kind of gets to the heart of this question. Why do you think the Western media is largely ignoring this story?
My theory about this is kind of what we talked about a couple of seconds ago, is because most of the modern journalists have been recruited from particular that ideological cultural environment, right, that is responsible in large part for this turn against fossil fuels, from this turn against nuclear energy in the first place. We have very good polls both in Austria and Germany, right, where they ask journalists whom would they vote for. And it's about, I think in Germany it's 40% would vote for the Greens, 30% would vote for the Social Democrats, 20% for the Liberals, and maybe the remaining 10% would vote for Conservatives. So it is absolutely clear where journalism, but I think the same is true for the United States as well, where they stand ideologically. And as you probably know, right, as both of us know, once you dedicate yourself to an ideology, you have a real problem with anything in reality that would run counter to it, that would run against it. So you can either try to, find ways to explain it away, and if that is not working, you ignore it, right? I think this is what we see when we later also talk about the protests, whether it's the Dutch farmers or in other areas of Europe as well. You simply stop reporting about it, right? It's
Right.
kind of, it's not happening.
It's gone completely silent. I mean, on certainly on the Dutch side, we've been covering it on our show, but it's almost impossible to really find. Even if you go to Dutch, we'll get into it in a minute. When you even go to Dutch newspapers, it's not on the front page. It's not even mentioned. It's buried. You can't find it on the BBC's website. It's buried. You're just not going to find this coverage. And a lot of this go ahead, Ralph.
Now, just real quick, because to the point you made before, right? And then you have people like George Monbiot going on. I think it was either the BBC or the Guardian, where he says, "Well, we just have to accept that milk, eggs, and meat, that was a luxury in the past, and we can no longer afford this in the future." Right? It's kind of this again quasi-religious idea. Now comes the dark time of where we have to forgo all the small pleasures of the past, when we know, and I know we're going to talk about this more in we have all the technical possibilities to allow people to, maybe not in abundance, but to continue the kind of consumption we have now, to what I would call, and this is always my big thing, which are the small pleasures for, the lower middle class, the working class, the people for whom it matters if a gallon of milk costs $1, $3, or $5. So it's easy for the, quote unquote, well-funded intellectual to say, well, we can no longer afford milk, because we all know that he's able to afford it, right? He will still have his milk when he wants it. But everybody else, well, they will have to find alternatives. And this is, I think, the bothersome thing here. It's the burden for these ideological goals, and that makes it so bothersome, right? If they would be true to their ideology and kind of also accept the suffering that would come with it themselves, I think then we can have a discussion about it. But it's always shifted to others. I mean, take the best example. You have John Kerry using a private jet to fly to Greenland and accept an environmental award. And when a journalist, honor where honor is due, right, has the guts to ask him, well, doesn't this seem a little weird? He says, well, everything I do for the climate, it entitles me to use a private jet. But, the average American or the average European who maybe once a year wants to take a flight and visit a relative or go on vacation, well, this is something we can no longer afford.
Right, and this is a crisis of our own making, and of course it adversely affects the poor. You write about this in your piece multiple times. You talk about how the extensive energy use this year in Germany and Europe, and how this will disproportionately affect the poor. Can you talk more about that, maybe elaborating more on this particular piece of it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, to give you one example, right, there are already discussions in some European countries that they say, well, maybe we have to close schools over the winter to save heating costs, right? Kind of to bring down the gas usage in public buildings, of which schools, of course, would in many cases be part of.
And that would be great. We saw that during the lockdowns. It didn't affect children at all, right? I mean, test scores are through the roof with lockdown. I mean, give me a break. We're seeing the reverberations of 2 years of lockdowns and what this did to children, right? So yeah, now we can't heat these schools. Let's lock them down again. I'm sorry to interrupt. It's just infuriating.
No, you're right. I mean, you're absolutely right. And to take the second example, right? We live in this, and this I think is not discussed enough. I know that Malcolm Gladwell got a little bit of blowback on this issue, but I think we don't discuss this enough. There is a group of people, and I'll be completely honest, I think you and I are probably part of that group of people. We can pretty much work from everywhere, right? As long as we have broadband, a camera, and a keyboard, we can do our job. So for us, high gas prices, we can kind of avoid the fallout because we don't have to commute. But the security guard, the waiter, right? People that actually have to go to the workplace and very often have to live further away from the workplace because they cannot afford to live nearby. They have to commute. So again, they are the ones, this is always the German thing and the Austrian thing, right? They say, well, why can't they use their bicycle? Well, sure, and I'm serious there, but that's really the argument. To say, well, they can ride a bike. Okay, fine, maybe in May, maybe in June. November and December, it's really not comfortable in the winter in Europe to ride your bike, particularly in Central Europe. Yeah. But it's easy because the people who promote this don't have to do it.
Yeah, ride your bike through the Alps in January, and see how that works out for you. I mean, the same thing is happening in the United States. We saw this with President Biden. We saw this with Democrats pushing this green energy package, this inflation reduction package, which was a huge boondoggle for the green energy companies. And the argument is, well, I can't believe that you're still driving a gas-powered car. Like, why haven't you bought an electric car, even though the average cost of them is $55,000, $65,000? What's wrong with you? You just haven't shelled out $55,000 for an electric vehicle. What's wrong with you people?
Yeah, and if you allow me to add something a little bit provocative, and what's so bothersome is this, because in so many ways, I feel this resembles the Europe of old, right? Where you had the kind of pre-revolutionary Europe, where you had the old aristocratic class that was in some parts entirely detached from the rest of the population, which then often caused revolutions. And I feel in a way we are in a similar situation when you hear, and I think that's true in Europe, but it's also true in the United States, particularly in the current government, when you hear politicians talk, right, whether it's the energy minister Granholm or Pete Buttigieg, and exactly as you say, they say, well, if people would just drive an electric car, they would not have these problems. You have to ask yourself, in which reality are those people living? And it's exactly this. These are two completely different classes that barely have any connection anymore. And this is I think very, very dangerous on the long run for any democratic system.
Absolutely. And I want to focus on Germany for a second before we move on to the Netherlands, which is about the exhausted supplies right now of firewood and stoves. According to a report out this morning, Germany could be facing blackouts and a collapse of the power grid this winter after citizens have started buying up electric heaters. Of course, fears that, of course, gas is going to be cut off. And now you're hearing from public utility companies saying this is going to be a disaster because if electric heaters are plugged in simultaneously when temperatures fall, it could cause a massive overload because they use between 1,000 and 3,000 watts of energy. And if everyone switched on a fan or a heater in their home, it would mean that they would almost have to double the existing network structure on every street in Germany. So hundreds of thousands of electric heaters are being purchased in Germany. 600,000 of them were purchased in the first half of this year, Ralph. That's crazy.
No, in the German case, we can only hope that it's going to be a very, very mild winter, right? This is kind of the last hope that there is. If it's a mild winter, if it's not going to be a cold winter, they probably can make it through. But if it should be a truly cold Central European winter, this is going to be a problem. And we still don't know. This is also the big question mark, what the Russians are going to do. There is still this possibility, right, that there might be a settlement in the war in Ukraine and that things kind of return to the pre-war status in October or November. And then these symptoms of larger problems will again start to go away because gas will start to flow. But we don't know this. But I think this is also what you see in German behavior a little bit at the moment, which in a certain sense, I don't necessarily find morally entirely worth of approval, but it makes a lot of sense politically, right? That there is hope on part of the Germans that this war is just going to end, independently of who's quote unquote winning. It's just to have it being done with and to reinstall the flows of energy, because as you just mentioned, the German system, German infrastructure that is heavily underinvested, is simply not prepared for such a crisis.
You've been writing extensively about the Dutch farmers and, of course, their plight under these new draconian government regulations levied by basically the World Economic Forum, which is telling us what we need to do with nitrogen levels. With the Dutch farmers, we see politicians, again, of course, making these choices that hurt the poor first. We've heard from Dutch farmers that we featured here on the show where they talk about the whole goal. They feel like something is at work where the whole purpose is for their land to be sold off so that large either government entities or large multinationals can come in and swoop up their land. So again, another example of governments choosing poor people to shoulder the burden of climate change against the wealthier people. What is the very latest happening right now in the Netherlands? They're not giving up. I mean, they're still revolting, but the mainstream media is not covering this story. What's the latest on this?
I think there are 3 points that I always find particularly interesting and important about the Dutch case. The first one is what is true, which some of the critics of mine have pointed out, not entirely mistakenly, is that many of these farmers are not financially in dire situations. They're fairly well off financially. But what I would say is that still doesn't change, I would say, in a certain sense, they're working class, because they're working class, they're actually producing things, right? They're actually producing agricultural output. And the reason why they're wealthy, and this is, I think, what completely is going under very often in this debate, is they are wealthy because they are very innovative. The Dutch are incredibly innovative in the entire area of agriculture, from livestock, to tulips, to other kinds, to tomatoes and potatoes. Like if you look at their yields per square kilometer. It's incredible, right? They're really, really good. And now you have the government come in and they target probably the world's most innovative and most efficient agricultural sector for what they call, from nitrogen to reduction of livestock, for reasons that, and this is again what my critical will say, they say, well, it is because, the European Union made these requirements. That's not a justification for me, right? If you say, if we don't do this, then there's going to be a collapse of nature, something bad is going to happen. That's an argument I can work with, we can discuss. But if your only line of defense for these actions, right, for the reduction in parts of 30% of a farmer's livestock is, well, the EU said so, that's not an argument for me, right?
Right.
That is not sufficient to say that it has to be done. And this is, I think, number one, what you mentioned is that the Dutch farmers are not giving up. And number two, I looked at Politico does this poll of polls. So this is pretty much the most up-to-date poll we have. And the Farmer Citizens Party, the BBB, which is kind of the political representation, they currently have one seat in the Dutch parliament. If elections would be held today, they would gain 22 seats and would be the second largest party in the Dutch parliament. So there are many parties in Dutch parliament, so 22 doesn't seem that impressive, but it would still make them the second most powerful. And I mean, if you jump from one seat to 22, that is pretty a strong indicator that the Dutch people seem to be strongly on side of their farmers, because they see it the same way. They say, this is like California. I mean, to some extent, California actually does do this. So this is another topic we can touch upon. But it's like telling Silicon Valley, so we're going to take 10% of the innovative startups and we're just going to close them down. Right? That doesn't seem like a very smart way to move forward, but that's exactly what you see happening in the Netherlands. You say, so we take the most innovative sector of our economy and we tell them to shut down in certain parts. And this also has spillover effects. Again, what people say, well, it's only livestock. It has nothing to do with other sectors of the agriculture. But that's not true, right? Because, for example, you need the manure for fertilizer production. So these things, agriculture is a holistic thing. I admit I have dedicated myself a lot in this over the last couple of weeks, and it's fascinating. I mean, modern agriculture is, in my opinion, a miracle. And just like in the realm of energy, what we talked with Germany, I think nuclear energy is literally a miracle. And given the fact, just if you allow me to throw it in there, I mean, technology-wise, we still operate power plants, on a state of the art from the 1960s and the 1970s. We can only imagine where we would be if we would not have stopped innovating and investing in these areas for 60 years. I'm absolutely convinced we could have nuclear fusion by now or be very close, but we stopped investing in it, right? If you were an energy company, and I'm sorry that I stopped my monologue, but I think this is such an important point. If you were an energy company and said, shall we invest in nuclear research? Like, your board correctly of investors will say, why? We know that they want to phase it out, right? They want to ban nuclear energy. Why should we spend money, smart people, good minds on an energy source that they're going to ban us from using anyways? So they invested in wind power, in solar, and they completely neglected one of the most innovative areas. And I think we see the same in agriculture in the Netherlands.
Monologues are allowed on this show. They're not allowed on mainstream media. So we welcome monologues because we can actually have deeper conversations about longer and very interesting topics that get cut off and edited on mainstream Western media. So we welcome them. So don't apologize for that at all. Somebody else who has been maybe a contemporary of yours, or maybe sort of swimming in similar circles, is Bjorn Lomborg. We've talked about him here on the show repeatedly. He points out that everyone talks about new innovation for climate change. And this kind of hits on what you were talking about, some of this old tech, and he says the portion of GDP that's actually being spent on research and development right now has been cut in half since 1980. So we are really only working with old chess pieces, old things, not really thinking about new ones at all, old tech, and then cutting this research and development costs in half.
Correct. Yeah. And the thing is, and this is mostly a phenomenon in the West, and there, because you mentioned the media before, and there you see kind of very, very often the selective reporting, right? There are so many reports, like a couple of years ago, Thomas Friedman at the New York Times did one, well, the Chinese, they invest so much in renewables, they do so much solar. That's all true. but they are at this very moment, they are investing in building more nuclear power plants than the rest of the world has done in the last 35 years. So they do the whole wind and solar thing, but this is just part of their energy mix. Like, you will never hear any Chinese politician saying we're going to end fossil fuels. They're also building massive coal-powered energy plants, because they have realized one thing that we have forgotten, I think, in the West. Energy is the key to wealth, right? Energy is the key to a middle class. You cannot have a middle class. You cannot have a sustainable future, I would almost say, right, without affordable energy. It's impossible, because energy is not just making heating more expensive. It's not just making your and my energy bills more expensive. It makes production more expensive. Let me give you one very quick example of this. We are now on the brink. Some of them do it in September. Others are planning to. Aluminum smelters are about to close down in September, right? Heavy industry. They say they don't know what to do. They can't afford those energy costs. Well, but again, these are good paying jobs that simply are going to get lost. We have, there is a tile factory that has operated in Germany for over 200 years. They moved their entire production to Turkey, right? This had a kind of some media resonance, because they said, why are you doing this? And they said the same thing. They said, we cannot do this at those energy costs. But those energy costs are not because of Russia. They are not because of Ukraine. They are not because of climate change. They are because a deliberate decision was made. That everybody knew who really engaged with the topic. A deliberate decision was made. They wanted high energy prices, because they said if energy is expensive, right, then people will shift away. People will start to save. So instead of saying, could we have energy abundance, they decided to go for energy shortages. This was a deliberate, and I would almost say immoral, if not criminal, decision. So this was not higher powers that caused this. These were political malfeasance, let's call it this.
No, I think you're absolutely spot on about that. Let's drill in a little bit more deeply on that World Economic Forum message or mission, right? Which is, if we force people and say, hey, the cost of fuel is just way too expensive, you need to buy an electric car, or in the case of Europe, you need to get a bicycle. Like, this is the future. If we make it painful for people, the same with meat costs, right? We'll tax meat so that you'll want to start eating bugs, which we featured here on the show, right? We will track all of your carbon footprints using carbon footprint trackers, so you will know your footprint, even though the companies that are responsible are all hypocritically doing worse than you will. So the World Economic Forum, these unelected billionaires that are running the show, I would argue they are arguably the biggest enemies in the world right now. Maybe it's not going to win me any friends, but that's my take on this.
No, I think you're correct, right? We can have a conversation. This is, I think, that's for me difficult to figure out what motivates them, right? Is it a malevolence, or is it really a complete ideological conviction that they truly believe what they are saying? Which increasingly is my suspicion. I think there are really influential people out there who believe the world is probably going to end in 8 years. I'm increasingly coming to that conclusion. But you said something else that is so important, and this is again the part they don't say out loud. If we would all switch to electric cars, we do not have the resources, from lithium to cadmium to others, to build the batteries, to build the cars. So again, the only way to make this happen is if a very large number of people simply never will have a car. So you're going to have, once again, and I know people get tired of using that term, but I do it nonetheless. You're going to have the elites who are going to have their electric cars and their private jets. And then you have the other people who are supposed to take the bus and the train, which is fine, right? I do it too. But I think people should have the option, and they should not, for ideological reason, make it difficult for them. And the same what you mentioned about, this trend where they kind of now promoting the eating bugs thing, kind of thing, right? They are so nutritious, and they're so, even if that's true, right? And they say, well, there are many societies that already do it, and that's all true. But it's societies usually eat bugs and worms and these kind of things if they don't have access to other forms of meat, to other forms of food. So it's, again, you want to move society backwards into a pre-industrial, a pre-abundance age. And I don't see why, because again, this is not going to save the planet. So this for me is, if you allow me this one sentence, because that's the topic that I always would love to talk about, but I never find my words for it. This strikes me very often as the ideology of a bored kind of upper bourgeois class. And I think it's no coincidence that it came up in the 60s and 70s, right? You had the generation before still lived through World War II. So they had an experience that marked them for a lifetime. But then there were those who were born in the late 40s, the 50s, the 60s, and they grew up in a strong middle class, the economic miracle in Germany, right? They grew up in material abundance, and I have a feeling there is a certain, whether it's guilt or whether it's boredom, but there is this combination that if there is nothing around that you can fill your life with meaning, right? We said religion, that's a bad thing. Nationalism, patriotism, that's a bad thing. Well, what was left for an ambitious, smart, young person kind of to identify with? Well, the environmental and green ideology. And this is one thing we have to admit. I mean, what is the breeding ground for these ideologies? You mentioned it before. It's universities, and it's those who are economically very well off. So I disagree with these people on almost everything, but they are not idiots, and they have many resources at their disposal. And it makes sense to some extent, because just like everybody else, they want to fill, I assume, not all of them, but I think this is part of the story, they want to fill their life with meaning, with content, right? They want to be part of something greater than themselves. And the only thing that at the moment seems to give you some form of societal recognition is this very specific area.
I think you're spot on about that, and I think that you're seeing this ideological battle unfolding, and we keep hearing it out of Vladimir Putin's mouth, right? Unipolar versus multipolar, and this idea that we're going to do away with sovereign powers, we're going to hand it over to these unelected leaders, and who are going to lead a green revolution and forget nationalism, forget countries' borders. You might have been growing soybeans for hundreds of years, but you're not going to do it anymore because we've decided that this other country over here is now going to grow soybeans. So forget borders, forget nationalism. And I think you're seeing this battle right now unfolding where Vladimir Putin is saying, no. The way is to protect sovereignty, idealism of a country versus this multipolar, this unipolar order. So, and I'm not saying he's right, and I'm not saying they're right. I'm saying this is the coming battle, I think, that we're seeing unfold before our eyes.
No, I think you're right. And maybe to add on something precisely what you said, what still surprises me, and I say this with all carefulness, because I think we you mentioned this in your discussion on the show as well about this. I mean, we don't have to I think there's no disagreement that invading a neighboring country is wrong, right? On many levels, right? Trying to annex your neighboring country is wrong. So I think that there's no doubt about this. But the thing for me is, for me, it is easy to say that this is wrong because this is kind of my coming out now on your show, right? I always considered myself somewhat of a national liberal or national conservative. So for me, borders were always important. For me, the idea of that different cultures should have kind of the right and the possibility to express themselves politically through having their own states was for me always a given. But now we have this weird situation that the very people that told us for 30 years that nationalism is, that's reactionary and old, and that open borders and one world. These are now exactly the kind of people who put little Ukrainian flags into their social media profiles. So I'm just surprised because I was told, that this is bad, and now all of a sudden they are uber nationalists. I mean, take one quick example that I find so hilarious. The left in Germany, when there was the soccer World Cup, as you guys would say, I would say the football World Cup in Germany a couple of years ago, they had, there was one op-ed after the other. I kid you not, about what if Germany wins the World Cup that could reignite German nationalism, and hopefully we lose the World Cup because otherwise, it's you win the World Cup and then you have the second coming of Hitler. So this was a straight line. So and they said people should not wave the German flag, but the European flag. So everything that was even remotely patriotic had to be squeezed out. And these very people are now kind of the most ardent defenders of another country's national sovereignty. Again, which I would defend as well, but I also would defend mine, right? Or take the United States. The same people that say, the southern border, that's not a problem, and why would you build a wall, right? No wall can be high enough. There's always a ladder that is higher, and all these platitudes are the same people that say now we need to transfer billion after billion after billion to Kiev so that they can defend their national sovereignty. Again, I want them to defend the national sovereignty too, but I also want to defend my national sovereignty. And I think the United States, many people want to defend theirs as well. So why is one quasi-fascist and the other one is my moral obligation? And I think it's again this finally the left has found a nationalism they can like. Right? Finally, they have found a flag they can put. And when you see this, where we have you have the little rainbow flag, and then you have next the little Ukrainian flag. So this is all. A lot of this is show. A lot of this is virtue signaling. which also pains me, of course, for Ukraine, because I think once these people move on to the next best thing, they will completely forget about this, right? Look at Afghanistan, right? Once they move on, it's going to be over. But it's we in the West have become such a, not all of us, right, but such a bored present tense culture that we kind of jump on all these things without considering its consequences. And energy is the best thing. Let's abandon nuclear because it makes me feel good. Let's only have wind and solar because it makes me feel good. And let's secretly buy gas from Russia so that we can still have the wealth that we actually like. Now, after the second part of the equation broke down, it turns out that all these feel-good things are probably going to make you feel really bad in the future. And nobody wants to admit it, right? I'm still waiting for the politician that stands up and says, listen, we made mistakes, huge mistakes, but we're going to turn the ship around. It's not happening. And it always reminds me of the Toynbee quote, right? When he's, civilizations don't die from murder, they die from suicide. And I think that is correct, right? It's not, the Roman Empire was not conquered by the more Roman Empire. They were conquered by materialistically less sophisticated, but culturally much more confident people. And you see how quickly things can erode then.
I think you're absolutely right. I think the destruction of the West, we're seeing it in the United States. We're seeing it's eating themselves from within, right? And this is the destruction of the West. This is the destruction of the United States, which is, sending $800 billion to a defense military industrial complex while its people are suffering. This is a man-made, created problem for the United States, and this is how civilizations collapse right in front of our eyes. And by the way, people will be starting to switch those Ukrainian flags for Taiwanese flags very, very soon. In their Twitter profiles. I bet that'll be next. Ralph Schoellhammer has been my guest. He's a journalist. I encourage you to read all of his great work. Ralph, where can people find your writings on a regular basis?
The best thing to do is, I hate to admit it, is if you follow my Twitter account. That's a good way. Or if you just Google my name, you should find it as well. Maybe if you allow me one, it's my vanity that comes through here, but I need to say this. Technically, I'm not a journalist. I'm actually an academic myself. So I'm a traitor to my profession. But I think this has turned out to be quite helpful for myself. But
so if you're doing research and you're getting to the heart of the matter, and you're uncovering facts and figures and important pieces of data that other people aren't seeing, wouldn't that fall under the auspices of journalism, or does that still fall under the auspices of academia?
I think it's a little bit of both. I mean, what kind of drove me towards journalism was, the thing I mostly do research on, exactly what you just mentioned in the end, is this inward turn, or this turn against itself within Western civilization and Western culture, right? There is no other, or I don't know of any other civilization that is constantly kind of attacking itself, right? That is constantly hammering away on the fundamentals it's being built on. Like, nobody else does this, right? The Chinese don't do it, the Indians don't do it, the Muslim world doesn't do it, right? For all the flaws they have, they are pretty aware of who they are and take certain pride in it. We are the only civilization that walks around the globe constantly apologizing for who they are, domestically and internationally. And this kind of brought me to journalism, because you see it reflected there. And I think one of the reasons why we see it reflected there is what we said before, is because they come out of exactly this kind of social milieu where these ideas, this civilizational self-hatred was marinated. And I still believe that the biggest risk we have, the biggest problem we have, is this question, because you can, in Europe, as a politician, you can no longer stand up, with one exception, and he's hated everywhere, right? It's Hungary's Viktor Orban. If you as a politician stand up and say, my main obligation is towards my own people, and then we can talk about all these secondary issues, right? Then we can talk about moral obligations to other nations, other countries. But primarily, we or I have been elected to serve my people. You no longer can say this, right? Even the idea that you say our foreign policy needs to serve our own national interest, this is something you can barely say. I mean, this is the one thing, this is really my last sentence. It remains my last big hope in the United States, that what we have seen, and for me, for all the flaws he made and for all the horrible things he said and did, the one kind of saving element of everything that Donald Trump did was I felt that for 4 years he gave not just the United States, but he gave the West a little bit of that backbone back, particularly with a speech he held in Warsaw in 2017, when he asked that very question, when he said, do we still have the confidence in ourselves to defend our values? And I think for all the flaws he had as a person, I think his instincts were in the right place. People like their culture, they like their identity, but they're terrified of speaking out about it because, again, the elites, whether it's media or academia, they immediately push you, as you mentioned at the beginning of the show, right? You like your country, so you like Hitler too, probably. That's exactly how these things are usually.
Right. Well, we've seen this, and we've been highlighting some of these politicians on our show, whether it's whether it's the president of Mexico or the president of Serbia saying, hey, we're going to, line up a gas deal with Russia because I don't want our people freezing during the winter here in Serbia, or Mexico saying, we're not going to show up to your North American summit if you're going to be hypocritical and not invite Cuba, not invite these other countries to talk about democracy when you yourself are clamping down. So we highlight those people and we celebrate those people, but they are too far and few between. They're few and far between, and the Western media vilifies them. You're absolutely right about that. Well, we covered a lot of ground. I love this discussion. I could continue it, and I'd love to have you back on here. My guest is Ralph Schoellhammer, again, journalist / academic. You can read his great writings. Follow him on Twitter. We really appreciate you being here on the show, Ralph. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for the time. It was fantastic being on with you.
Absolutely. And thanks to all of you for subscribing and making us a part of your regular watching. Please subscribe and smash that like button, and we will see you back here once again. Thanks, everyone.